All right, one of the important things we thought about to start this whole thing off, besides fishing, and of course everybody knows about their tackle and that kind of stuff, which we're going to get into, but something that gets overlooked a lot of times is boat safety. And Adam, us being charter captains, we have to look at this and be on top of it all the time. So what would be some of the things that you would say that get overlooked a lot?
So, for charter captains, we have an actual punch list, and we have quite a few more restrictions than the average boater. But things, on small boats, especially, make sure that your trailer lights, your trailer itself is in good condition.
Right.
Drain plugs, if you have them. I don't know anybody that's never done that. If you're being honest, I don't think anyone can say they haven't.
I unfortunately did it 2 years ago with my 31.
With your big boat.
In my big boat, yeah, that was exciting.
But as far as water, marine safety, definitely check your flares. You need to have flares on. If you're going out on the Great Lakes, you need to have flares. You need to have a marine radio that's functional. So make sure that your flares, they will have an expiration date on them. They do expire. When you go to buy flares at the store, make sure you check the expiration date because you don't know how long they've been on the shelf there. So that's one thing for sure. Marine radio, you do need to have one if you're going out on the Great Lakes. And make sure that is sending, receiving. A good place to do that is from the parking lot, not necessarily from the water once you get your line set up.
Yeah.
So always make sure, you can check the connections of the antenna is more likely the problem than anything else. So make sure that.
I like looking at it from making sure that you can receive the weather transmissions. You just put it on there, then at least you're receiving there before you go to the water, and then do, like you said, then do an actual check.
Yeah, do your radio check, and
a sounding device. A lot of people look at their horns. You may not have a horn on the boat that's working, or it may, who knows, got corroded, or a mouse made a nest in it. Make sure you have a sounding device, horn,
and a backup.
And a backup, yeah. I mean,
air horn.
I teach the captain's course, and we are told you have to have a frog, something to make a sound. And of course, if you're over 16 foot, then you got to have an air horn or a backup, a whistle. So make sure you have those things.
So those are definite. Fire extinguishers, you need to make sure that your fire extinguishers are charged. They have to show that they're charged. If you get stopped, they will check that. That a lot of times, if you do get stopped, they'll check your spark arrestor too. So you got to make sure your spark arrestor is clean. That's your basically your air filter on a IO or an inboard boat. Lights on the boat themselves. Make sure your nav lights are correct and working.
I know on the fire extinguishers too, one of the coasties had told me that, they can show charge, but you want to kind of shake them up, make sure that they're not all settled down into that, especially if they're older ones that are still holding a charge. So it's a good thing to have, because they like to look at that. If they see they've been banged on, knocked on the dock a little bit like that, then it works out a lot better for them.
Yeah, definitely fire extinguishers. And if you ever need a fire extinguisher, having one that works is a definite advantage. I've been in that situation before, not on a boat, knock on wood, but I had to use one before, and you're very excited if it works.
Oh yes, for sure.
Right. Batteries is another thing, especially in our scenarios because we're using a lot of battery power. We need a lot of battery power. One recommendation that I make, if you're storing cold storage, is take your batteries out. Take your batteries out, store them in your house somewhere in the basement. Don't set them on concrete, but store them somewhere on a shelf, whatever it is. Trickle charge them if you have a maintenance charger. But always make sure your batteries are charged up and then load test them. And you can take your batteries anywhere. Any place that sells batteries will load test your batteries free of charge.
Yeah, I know AutoZones. AutoZones they'll come right out to the truck and do them for you. Another thing too, going along with the batteries, is look at your batteries in your flashlights. You have a handheld flashlight. We have to have the throwable device, the man overboard. Yep. Make sure those dates are good and that they're working, because worst thing's going to happen is you're going to get on the lake, you'll be ready to set lines, and you're going to want a flashlight to look at something, and it doesn't work.
And your probe too.
Yeah, big time.
I know that it's not the end of the world if your probe doesn't work, but if you go out fishing for the first time, I've had plenty of times where the probe did not work, and we did not have extra batteries. So that's definitely something to check.
Yeah, I mean, in the springtime, yeah, we're not probably worried about temp there, but definitely that speed down there where you're fishing and stuff. And especially on the older probes where they are 9 volts, those things 8 to 9 volt batteries up. So, make sure you got extra batteries on board for those just in case. And I actually have a little bag of batteries that I carry. I carry 9s, 8, double A's and triples just in case you need it. You never know.
Yeah, we have all the batteries that we use on the boat. We carry extras, so that's always a good thing. The other thing with batteries is if you take your batteries out, my recommendation is when you take your positive terminal, you take usually a wing nut or a nut that's on there, take that off. Take everything that is on that terminal before you disconnect it and zip tie it together. And then do the same thing on your negative side. That way, when you go to put stuff back, every wire is there that needs to be there. So that's a trick that we use anytime we take our batteries out. If we take our batteries out any reason during the season, we zip tie all the wires together.
And especially because they're not always going to be the black is the negative and red you're positive. You may have rewired something, it could be a white being a negative or something. And, you make sure those things are together.
Last thing before you go out, for sure, check your pumps. Check your through-hole fittings to make sure none of them are leaking immediately when you put in. A lot of boats have, a lot of smaller boats have I'm blanking here, have a aerator pump for your live well pump. They're usually located somewhere in the stern, but make sure that you don't have any, if there's water sitting in any of those fittings and your through holes and cracked that fitting over the winter, you'll take in water faster than you would imagine.
And also the drains, make sure the drains are working on them because, I had it when I borrowed my dad's boat one year and we were using the live well and he, of course, had kept it outside over the winter, had an animal get up in there. They plugged up the drain. Oh, yeah. And with that drain being plugged, it just was not a good thing. All of a sudden you're looking back, why is the boat filling with water? Well, because you got your live well not working right. So yeah, just do basic maintenance.
Just a quick little thing. So last year someone called me and they were taking on water slowly and they couldn't figure it out. And a mouse had actually chewed through the speedometer, the water pressure speedometer.
Okay, yep.
And they were taking on water from that. So, I mean, these are all things like you get your boat out, you put it in the water, you take it for your shakedown, open your bilge up, make sure there's not water coming in that shouldn't be.
I mean, we all want to get to the fishing part. That's the interesting part. This is all the maintenance stuff that we don't really want to look at. But these are the things that, everybody in the clubs have all seen people on the side of the road because they didn't check their trailer bearings, they didn't check their brakes or something went wrong, or they don't have their spare tire, their spare tire's dry rotted. Make sure these things are all ready. It'll make those trips a lot more enjoyable once you get to the water.
And then the last thing to cover, I think, on here is pumps. Bilge pumps need to be functioning. If you're a guy that uses rubber bands for releases, rubber bands get into your bilge pumps. They can, stop them from working.
Little pieces of mono.
Little chunks of mono. Dog hair is another bad one. The best way to check your pump is to take 5 gallons of water and pour it on your pump.
Yep.
And it should pump it, that should activate it. It should pump that water out. That'll check your float. That'll check everything. If your float's sticky, do something. Fix it somehow. A lot of times you can just take degreaser and spray it and get it cleaned back up. A lot of times they kind of gum up from that.
Or take a garden hose and just run it instead of the 5-gallon buckets. If there's a problem, take that 5-gallon bucket with the high pressure, not real high pressure, but it'll still go in there and wash it out. We stay in our boat over the holidays, so we have our dog with us, like you mentioned there, Raven sheds. And I can't tell you, I was surprised that you even mentioned that because we didn't think anything of it, and we'd cleaned the boat and everything, and also I'm like, why is my pump not pumping? Well, there was dog hair down in that bilge. So it's definitely little things that can happen.
And take your dog boating. Just make sure that you account for the hair.
Yeah.
So, all right.
So now that we've got all the maintenance stuff out of the way, let's look at tackle.
Yeah, tackle organization is, I think, often overlooked. I know a lot of guys use special mate boxes, which is a great way to do it. When I used special mate, I kept my glow spoons or, all the dolphins were together, all the glow spoons were together on down through that box. As I got more and more equipment, we've gone to a system of smaller Plano boxes in racks, and I probably carry 4,000 or 5,000 spoons
Well, you're a floating tackle
on
shop.
the boat. So, but keeping them organized is huge. And Mark and I have both ran into it. We talk a lot on the water, and I'm catching fish on something, and he'll, I'll tell him what it is. If he can go and find that in a short order, that's a huge advantage.
And remember this: the organization is anything. Like you mentioned, the special mates, the Plano boxes, whatever. I know that most of us at the end of the year, you're kind of like, all right, hey, deer season's coming, or the next season that you're going into is coming. And sometimes these boats get put away and nothing's happened. I just did that on my boat. My bait station was all sitting there, and I still had every spoon, plugs, rotators, meat rigs, everything was out. And it was still sitting there. So you got to put it away so you can organize it the way you want and have things ready to go. And this is a good time because right now we're all sitting around. We can't go ice fishing. We can't go out into the woods because of no hunting season unless you're going to chase rabbits or something like that. But for the most of us, we're going to be looking for things to do. So now's the time to just organize it, whichever way works best for you.
Absolutely. And, as your tackle collection grows, you'll have to change your organization strategy, but the idea of everything has a place to where it goes will really help in the long run, because you're not, as long as you put something back where it goes, you can always find it again.
Well, I think one of the big things going along with how it changes is they've got those nice like file boxes for the rotators and stuff. Well, I know you and I both, we go to the Rubbermaid tubs, or the clear tubs that we can see, so you can grab them and you know what your 8 inches are, you know what your flies and all those things. So you might want to take a look and say, does this application work, or do I need to change what I'm utilizing to make it more efficient?
Yeah, and in the Rubbermaid totes, I know a lot of small boats. This weekend you're going to be walleye fishing. Next weekend you're going to be salmon fishing. The weekend after that you're going to be bluegill fishing, and then you're going to spend, the day out on the water tubing or doing something else. So it's nice to have things be able to move on and off the boat easily and quickly. So there is a lot of great products out there, and that will help with that organization. That being said, though, too, something that we do in the off season, we actually do this constantly. It's something that everyone that fishes on our boat is very aware of, and that is checking leaders, fly leaders, the length of the leader. A lot of times you're running pickled sunshine, or you're running a mirage fly and it's working great and it breaks off. So you find a 10-inch rotator that has the same fly, and you take the fly and you put it on the 8-inch.
Cannibalization.
Which is a fine thing to do, except for the leader length of a 10-inch and an 8-inch to be effective are going to probably be a different length. And same with paddles. But on our boat, when we put something away, we take our fingers and we run it down the leader every time. The same thing when we're reeling in a rod. Anytime we get to mono, we have our fingers on that, right by the reel, have our fingers on that leader, and we are checking that leader for nicks. If there's a nick, it's changed instantly. Yep. There's never a question. There's never, that needs to be changed next time we go. We just change it.
Well, now that works out well when we've got, yourself and, Mike is back there and you guys are able to, do that right away, or I'm back there with my mate. If you can't because you've got every Tom, Dick, and Henry on the boat and you're like, no, I want to be the one to do that, then get yourself a marker. What I did this year is we put rubber bands on it. If a reel was rubber banded, when we came in, then that thing had a problem, and we would remember it, and I'd write a note, that's nicked, change leader, retie or whatever. Now, it's a lot easier if you got to retie a copper or lead when it's out in the lake and just wrap it around and then change it out and then spooling it off, but definitely address it immediately.
Yep, absolutely. People, my take on it is always that, you go out and spend all this money on this lure that'll catch a fish, and this, special rotator that's going to help me catch more fish, or a piece of electronics that's going to help me catch more fish. They're not going to help you catch more fish. They're going to help you get more bites. And if you have any kind of a terminal tackle failure during the fighting of the fish that you paid all this money to get the bite, it's gone.
Oh,
and monofilament is cheap, and terminal tackle is, in the grand scheme of things, not that expensive. And that's stuff that if it's no good, get rid of it. Change it. We change leader I mean, we fish 100 days plus a year, but we're changing leaders probably 4 or 5 times a season.
But with that being said, we're changing it because of use. What I found is that sometimes I'll get on other people's boats, and it's their first time out this year or whatever, and they'll say, "Well, I've had this line on there for the last 6 seasons." So you get some with just sun rot, dry rot, because they keep it in a spot that maybe isn't cool and constant. They may keep it next to a wood stove, or it's out in the garage up in the rafters where all the heat's rising, and you get problems with it. So definitely, it's cheap. I did a whole presentation on just line itself one time for a club, and it's important to look at those things. And going with that is also looking at your connective material, your terminal tackle, your swivels,
Absolutely.
and your split rings and things, and make sure they're the right sizes.
And there's a lot of different brands. There's a lot of different styles, and there's sizes as well. When I brown fish, I use smaller terminal tackle. If I'm using stick baits, I generally don't run a swivel. I just run a snap. These are things that I do. I don't know that they produce any more than the other methods, but I always use ball bearing swivels. I don't use anything that's not a ball bearing swivel. Well,
Other than a snap.
or other than like the backside of a rotator where there is no rotation in the swivel. But for the most part, everything is ball bearing. I like cross locks or some kind of locking swivel.
You like to hurt your fingers, what you're trying to
Well,
say.
yeah, but they don't come loose. They don't open up.
Well,
And
okay, so with those cross locks, are you looking for the ones with the rounded ends, or are you doing the ones with the V ends?
with just the like hook that goes through.
Just a regular hook, okay.
Yes, we use primarily all Dreamweaver swivels, but that's the style of swivel that we're using pretty much exclusively, and snaps as well.
Okay.
Similar, I use VMC snaps, but they're the same style. We'll get some sort of a graphic up for that, so you
Especially
can
showing that bend, because one of the things is that bend that you have down there for the swivel or the spoon to move and not be pinned.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're using back holds, they require a rounder bend than a spin doctor does, or maybe a stinger or some whatever kind of pro troll flasher. And if you look at a back hold swivel, it'll be different. So that's something too, because you won't get the right action out of a back hold if you're using the wrong swivel.
And one of the things too is you look at the spoons. You look at a Streak, or you look at a Stinger or a Moonshine. They don't come with split rings on the spoons. If you look at the Dreamweavers, they come with split rings. And rule of thumb is if they come with it, keep it. If it's not on there, don't put it on there, because it's not designed to run with that.
Yeah, and it's something that I don't know. I'm kind of like both ways. Sometimes if it has a split ring, we run it. Sometimes we'll add a split ring to something.
But that's to tweak it.
But that's to tweak it.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
That gets into a whole other discussion of tips and tricks there.
In repeating whatever it is, for sure.
Yeah.
Another thing to talk about, prep is with your leaders on your rods and your divers. So when we fish, we normally change leaders before tournaments. The way that the tournaments that we fish are structured, about the time when it would be to change, we change every leader.
Yep.
It doesn't matter if we haven't used the rod, we change the leader.
Right.
Monofilament is not very expensive. If your boat, however you're storing your rods, I carry 60 rods on the boat. Most people probably don't use something like that. But, if they're all laying on your bed downstairs or in a rack or whatever, there's just as much chance that a leader could get nicked in that situation. And, you nick a leader, you're going to lose $1 swivel and a $7 spoon every time. So, take $1 worth of monofilament and change those out. Learn those knots will make it makes it a lot easier to do that. And
Well, going along with the storage there, so we worry about it from a storage standpoint, but a lot of the clubs run the rods and they have to break them down because they're traveling. So every time you break that rod down and you're bending it,
Absolutely.
you're putting a fatigue spot in that line possibly, but more so on wire. If you're breaking down a wire rod, there's fatigue spots. I store my wire rods up under my my hardtop. And, my 10 footers I have to break down. Well, every time I do that, I'm checking to see. And last year I caught a couple of them. So I'm actually thinking about not putting them underneath the hardtop every time, leaving them out so I don't get that possibility.
Yeah, we try to never, with our diver rods, try to never have them slack, ever. And that really helps to keep from getting twists and
curly cues.
Twist in your line, curly cues in your line. But if our line starts to curly cue, we strip it back and retie it.
Yep, line is cheap.
Line is cheap. Yep. Another thing with that though is, you're checking your leader, you're checking your line. Check your guides. Check your level wind on your rod. Make sure there's no burrs anywhere. If you're consistently getting nicks in your line, check every guide on that rod to make sure there's no chips in that porcelain. If you're using copper on a porcelain insert, a lot of times it'll chip. I'm a big proponent of using the correct rod for the correct application. And, we use all Akuma rods on ours. I mean, Tellura makes them as well. But the metal guides for copper, the copper goes through it easier. It's less likely to backlash in your reel because it's hanging up on a guide.
And a lot of guys
does make your life easier.
And a lot of guys are using the sproles to attach because they don't have the confidence of the knots, or you've made repairs and you're using a haywire twist and the coppers, and that's all going to be wearing on those rods. And then I know for me, you mentioned you got 60 rods. Well, I'm carrying 20 to 30 rods, but I've got 62 reels.
Yep.
So if I'm swapping reels on and off, I want to make sure that application for that rod's going to not mess me up if I change it from a copper to a core and have that end up nicking things up. It's important as far as that goes, for lengths and such.
Yeah, and the same thing with your divers. Retie your divers. If your diver line, check your diver every time. Check that line. Check the snubber to make sure the snubber's in condition if you're using those. Make sure that line has no nicks. If it starts to get a ton of memory, you can tie it off to something, hook it around something, and stretch that, and it will get rid of some of the memory. I don't like my divers to have a lot of curl in the line.
Especially these days when we're driving these divers into the mud so much, they're getting nicked up and things of that nature. Yeah, and that's
the sand actually, and the zebra mussels. Actually, it almost feels like you took sandpaper and was rubbing it on the line. So we do change on our trout. We run separate divers for trout and for salmon, and for spoons and rotators. We have all different sets of divers that we use. Most people don't do that. But, we're constantly changing all of those leaders.
Well, and even as you're changing those, and you mentioned the snubbers, but let's also look at those weights. Because like you said, we are using different ones. I like my deeper divers, and sometimes, my mates gets emotionally attached to that certain diver, and we're running it, and the twist mechanism, and it's so full of sand, it sounds like you're grinding gears in there, or the weight's been beat up so bad with sandpaper. We had one last year, we cast it out to set it, and the weight went goodbye.
Yeah.
And he about cried over that. So check your divers is what I'm saying on all these things.
And if you do use divers for trout, once they become no longer round, they don't dive as well. And maybe no one has that problem but me, but
No.
I have some oblong divers.
Well, no, I've shown those a few times for both people that have come over on the boat and seen them. But you know what? I do find sometimes that they do work the best because they give you a different oscillation. So again, it's that emotional attachment. It's that emotional attachment you get.
I know. So definitely check your leaders, check your divers, check your rod guides, all that stuff, your level wind, make sure your reels are in time. We store all our reels with the drags released all the way. So make sure engage the drag, pull on it, just make sure that the drag is working. Anything
Clickers.
else on there? Oh, clickers. Yeah, check your clickers. Clickers are one of those things that certain reels definitely have issues with clickers going out. Clickers will get you to a rod a lot faster than seeing the bite. That sound. So
and I want to go back to when you were talking about being in time. What we're talking about in being in time on that level wind is making sure that as that thing passes back and forth, that it's laying in there right. It's not at an angle, so when it's going back, it's like rotating back and forth on the spool. It may be just as simple as you spool it all the way out and rewind it up.
That's the easiest
That's
way.
the easiest way. But you may have a worm gear that's going bad.
Yep.
And think about it. How long was the last time that you greased and cleaned your reels? I mean, if you're storing your reels and everything, and they're in the garage or in the attic, or heck, you left them on the boat, they do get gummed up, and you want them to be smooth and working properly. Yeah, if they were great when you put them away, no problem. But make sure they're right. Make sure it's not one of those things was, hey, I need to fix this, and you forgot about it. So it's a good way of going through it.
Yeah, and by trying to stay up on the maintenance, it makes the maintenance easier. When you don't have 5 hours of maintenance to do, you only have a little bit. We retie everything every day. So it's something breaks, something gets damaged, whatever, we fix it that day. But we fish every day.
And hopefully and hopefully if you have a crew that you're working with, that they're going to come over and give you a hand to help this through. I was fortunate when I was fishing a lot of club tournaments. I had a great crew, Ray, Dick, Walt, all those guys. They sharpen hooks. I still have a special mate, tackle mate that says, sharpened by Walt. Well, Walt's no longer with us, but it's on there because he would take a box home over the off season, and he'd sharpen all the hooks because that's what he wanted to do. I'm not saying that you have to sharpen all your hooks, but you can mark it. Hey, this box has been gone through. This is good. My 8 inches rotators are good. Everything's in its place and ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, the more prepared you are before you get on the water, the more successful your day is going to be, and safe,
and more enjoyable. Because you're not going to be sitting there going, shoot, I should have done that. And it doesn't matter if it's like you mentioned, Akuma or anything like that. But one of the things there, going back to the rods and things, is if you have a roller rod, check those roller tips. I know, especially with Shimano's, the 8-footers, they don't swivel, and they're fixed. And I hate it when I look over there and the person stuck a rod out, they let it go, and it's not lined up, and so it's pulled over to the side, and you get the grooves in the end of the tips. And that's bad. I know on my 10-footers, they swivel, so there's no issues. Now, if you're not using roller guides and you're using the ceramic and you got a twilly tip on the end, make sure that twilly tip's good, that it's not all gummed up.
And check the wire will eat through those guides. Even it's usually your guide next to your reel is the one that has the most wear. Obviously, use the twizzle tip if you can.
Now, what about braid? We didn't really talk about braid. What do you think about braid?
So braid, So one thing that I set up all my rods have braid back. The reason, so not entirely. So I start with a brand new reel. It gets about 5 wraps of 30-pound mono. That gives the braid something to grip to.
Right.
And then if I say I'm using a Dakota 800 or a Convector 55, whatever it is, and I'm only running a 200 copper on there, I'm going to have 200 copper to braid, and then fill the rest of the spool with 30-pound mono, and that just fills that spool up
For take-up.
But even if I don't want any take-up in there, I still have at least 5 wraps of mono, and that protects the reel from wire. If you're running like on a diver, that protects the spool itself from the wire, but it also gives something for the wire to grip to, and gives something for the braid to grip to, so that it doesn't spin.
Now, with that copper and lead course, what I'll do with that too is I'll put a piece of heavier mono, say 50-pound, where I'm putting my board, or make sure it's at least 30-pound, and then have my backer going up to it. I know some guys will run braid, but I do think you need to have yourself probably about a 10-foot section of mono that's there for that board to attach to.
So I agreed to somewhat disagree on that. So I always did that. It was always something that I did. And at the beginning of every year, I would always check that piece of mono. And I would always check, and I still to this day check the braid where the termination is to either the copper or the lead core. We have since moved to Ninja boards from Dreamweaver, and we are not using the mono insert point anymore. We use a wrap on the board, which I have available on a video on my YouTube channel. You can check it out how those work. But in my mind, the less amount of knots that I have to have, the better off.
Oh, agreed. Now, but my question to you is, if you're not, because I'm running the Ninja boards too,
And you run it with the monos.
but I run it with the mono on there, due to the legend making
Yeah.
sure that we have to have this, but not running it with the mono in there. If you're running the other boards where you're pinching on in that, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah. So if you're running church tackle boards or offshores or something, I think that the mono helps.
Yeah.
There are some releases that work pretty well, but the braid even tends to groove those releases.
Well, and I did do that. I ran the offshore, the red ORs for the offshore. I'd modify my church boards and everything, and they worked really well. And they would grip that braid until that braid wore through the little tit on it, and then they would just pop off. So that's where we went to the mono segment, and it's kind of spilled over here. And like I said, the legend likes to have that on there, so we just leave it be.
Yeah, it kind of is whatever works for you. My personal feeling is that a knot is a failure point, and the least amount of knots, the better off you are. I'm a huge believer in braid for backer. The main reason is that, if you're only running 2 planer boards aside or 1 planer board aside, you probably don't need braid. We run 4 or 5 aside, where it's pretty common for us to even have up to 6 boards out on each side.
Yeah, you take up a lot of room out there.
Take up a lot of, we always move for people, but that
you heard it here. He'll move for you.
The braid cuts through the air better, and you don't get that bow.
Yeah.
And what the bow in the mono from the tip of the rod to the board is what gets down into the water, and then the boards jump. And by using braid, you can alleviate some of that. Now, in a small boat, your rod tip isn't 13 feet out of the water either. So, you have the less bow that you can have in that line, the better off you are.
All right. Well, since you're talking about bows in the line, I know this is one place where you and I differ. We both like to fish deep. He is very, very good at fishing lake trout deep. And what I did is I went to on my rigger rods, having the leader, my mono leader. Usually it's about 50 foot that I tie to my braid, because I got braid on the backer, and I got my big 700 Dakotas out there to put down with my rigger, so I don't get that blowback. Now I know you're not a rigger braid guy, so
well, I am at a certain point.
I'm all the time. I mean, mine's all the time. It doesn't matter when I'm running.
We're really particular about our riggers and how we run them. So we actually have 3 sets of rods that we run for riggers. One that's pretty much just for lake trout. They're a light rod, lighter line, usually just 20 pound on those. Once we get deeper than 120, 130, 150 for sure, we switch to braid. And it's, I'm running a 23 pound cannonball on Magnum metals. And if you run mono down 200 feet on a 23 pound cannonball, it'll blow back twice as far as if you run braid. And I am still running wire on my riggers. I like to run wire on my riggers. I know some people use Power Pro or some kind of braid, which is, to each their own on that. My personal belief is that wire has a different vibration in the water,
Different harmonics.
and I think it can be affected by different boats as well. If you have some kind of a negative ion thing or some kind of a grounding deal where you have a negative voltage or a positive voltage,
On my
I think
30,
it can change.
Yeah, well, on my 31 that I had that problem, and that's where we decided to change over, because I had a great rigger bite, and then one year my rigger bite went away, and nothing really changed other than we're like, is there this problem? And we spoke to Greg McGee, Blue Fairways, and he said, did you ever check to see if you're discharging? And we did, and we found out we were discharging. I did put a black box on the boat, but then I did change the riggers over to Power Pro. And, everything just went back to normal. It cleaned everything up. So I do run the Power Pro on ours. Got those cannonballs from you, and you run them on my Trax Techs, so those are working. Wonderful, but I do run that braid. And I run that braid on everything for the season. It's just, to me, it's more forgiving for nicks with charter customers. There's there. Now, we did have a good discussion on this about the stretch and when they're fighting the fish and not being as forgiving.
Yeah.
But now we get into physics and everything, and yeah, that's for another whole discussion.
Yeah, there's a lot of theories. A lot of people fluorocarbon use, where to use fluoro, where not to use fluoro. Fluoro is a tricky thing, Fluoro is
Can be expensive.
it's very clear. It doesn't. It's almost invisible in the water, so that's a bonus of it. It does not stretch. So if you're using fluoro as leader on your lead core doesn't stretch. Fluoro doesn't stretch. So you better be.
There's no shock absorber.
Yeah,
on
there's no shock absorber, and the same thing with divers. I use fluoro on my salmon divers, and I use a snubber on my salmon divers, and I use mono on my lake trout divers and no snubber. Mm-hmm. And we've just found that those are the best for us. The way that we fish, that's the best way to lose the least amount of fish.
So what pound test then when you're using no snubbers on your divers? What do you use your pound test?
So we're using 25 and 30 with no snubber. That's with monofilament line. We use Suffolk Superior, which is a super abrasion resistant line. I have a great faith in that line. And it does have, some stretch to it. And we've just been doing it that way without the snubber and been successful.
So with the snubber then, what are you using, the same test?
40.
You're using 40
pound fluoro.
Okay.
Yep.
Because what I'm using is on my trout, I'm using 50 to the bait. And that way then, for hand lining and
Mm-hmm.
stuff is easier for grabbing it. And then when I use the snubber, then I'm using either 40 or 50.
Yep.
Just because, one of the things we do is we steer the fish when it's coming to the boat,
Yep,
especially
absolutely.
with charter customers that aren't great at fighting the fish. We actually use the net and push it out, get it out and lift it over a diver or whatever. And it just a little more forgiving and can take that beating.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found that, salmon are incredible beasts, mm-hmm. and they hit extremely hard, and lake trout don't strike the same way, and you can get away with lighter line. A salmon dive, like a lake trout diver, we're never going to be running a salmon rig on there.
Right.
So we don't necessarily worry so much about salmon hitting those rigs.
Right.
It's usually some kind of a lake trout specific.
Yeah. But for the weekend warrior, you can have a leader wrap, or one of those leaders tied up that is just for your Lakers instead of having the whole rigs as far as that sets up. But going back to the downriggers, I run the Blacks releases on mine. So, going back to checking, I'm making sure that my knots are good with my Power Pro. I actually do retie them every year just due to the fact that they're down there in that mud when we're pounding the bottom and things, and they're going up and down and you're getting swings. So you want to make sure that those are good. Make sure those blacks haven't gotten a wear spot in the release, and that the wire. I don't know if you leave the wire still in it. We've got some that we've experimenting with taking the wire out, so it'll actually slide on the Power Pro and have a bead at the top.
Oh, yeah,
on that. So we did try that. I like the wire better, I'll say, so far. But that is a way of making sure that you do check your riggers, make sure those are working as well.
Yeah, when we started fishing the bigger cannonballs, we started with a 20-pound cannonball, and then we'd actually developed our own mold. One of my brother-in-laws who fishes tournaments with us, he's a pretty awesome fabricator, and he created a mold, and it's 23-pound cannonball, and the terminal tackle, the termination at the end is a critical point of failure. And we've had to play around with that. We actually ordered saltwater swivels that were 300-pound rated. We took some old True Track biscuit terminators, and we modified those with stainless steel bolts. And that's what we're running now. And we've eliminated these problems. But
well, I'm glad you told me this, Adam, because I got those cannonballs off you, and I haven't run one of them yet.
yeah, you're running Power Pro.
But I got the Power Pro on there, but I didn't think about the snaps being so that's a good tip for me to make.
So we've been
make a
learning.
note on that, as far as that goes. So, and again, make sure that your riggers are working. We talked about going through the batteries, but check your terminals on your things. Make sure all the connections are good there.
Connections, especially if your riggers are running slow, it's usually a low voltage situation, and that can be caused by even corrosion, corrosion in your batteries, corrosion in a fuse if you have an inline fuse. So yeah, those are all things that you definitely want to check. The bad thing with corrosion and with connection issues is you don't ever really see that until there's a lot of load. And once the load is above what the wire can handle or that connection can handle, then you start to see that voltage drop.
Well, I think you made a good point there about the wire. One of the things that I had is had my Trax techs, had them installed, by a qualified technician that does all my electronics. But when I started pulling the bigger cannonballs, I'm like, why is this thing slowing down so bad? It was the gauge of wire that he didn't use. He didn't use the big enough wire, so the load did come on. So that might be something to look at too, because if you decide to start fishing down into the deep, deep regions of the Great Lakes, you're going to want to make sure that rigger, even though it's capable of pulling it up, that you have the right wire gauge so that you don't get any of the drawdown.
Yeah, it becomes a more and more of a concern as you add more and more in the back. We run electric reels on our divers, so we have 4 electric reels, and then we run 4 downriggers on the back. One is just for a probe, but so we run three downriggers. When you're fishing deep, you're probably only running 2 of them down all the way. But you start running 4 electric reels and 2 downriggers down there, up and down, 200 feet. That's it gets to be quite the strain on the battery system. So that's important to know that your batteries are good, know that they can handle the load, and make sure that your wire is the right gauge.
And going along with that, something that I found on my new boat, just had brand new motors. Nice big Cummins 6.7 diesels put into that. Nice big alternators and everything. And still brand new and everything. I noticed this fall when we put it away, my port alternator had looked like smoke that had come out of the one side. And so, you know what? You got to realize too that in charging these batteries and everything, as we're running our motors and that, those alternators are going to work. Yeah. So you know what? This when you make sure that you check those belts and everything. I'm having that alternator rebuilt, but check your belts, down there too, absolutely. Because if your charging system isn't working, you can have everything else perfect. It's all basically a domino effect.
Belts, hoses,
everything.
All that stuff is, it wears out. It doesn't wear out from hours. It wears out from time.
Yep, for sure. So let's talk about knots, because we talked about terminals, sure. and you made a comment that every knot's a breaking point.
Yeah.
So I'm a big advocate of using the sproles. I know you like tying things together.
I use the sproles.
Right, but I know you also like tying the uni to uni knot. And I know that's one thing that I've talked over and repetitively to my club that says, hey, we got to learn our knots, but let's talk about how you're splicing stuff together.
Okay, so I'll just kind of go through the knots that I use, I guess.
Yep, that'd be great.
So my primary knot that I use almost everywhere is I have switched to a uni knot. A uni knot is pretty simple to tie, and it's exceptionally strong. There's actually some videos out that you can see where they test the strength breaking point, and uni knot was one of the best. So I use a uni knot. So if I'm tying terminal tackle on, I'm using a uni knot. If I'm tying braid to mono, I'm using a uni to uni knot. And so it's a knot, it's similar to a blood knot, but it's very simple to tie compared to a blood knot. Blood knot is not the easiest knot in the world to tie. If we are running mono into braid, or mono into lead core, I guess I should say. So when I tie lead core to braid for the backer, I'm removing about maybe 8 to 10 inches of lead, and then I'm tying a uni.
Okay, so you're using the Dacron that you've got there out of the lead, the sheeting. When you're tying that, you're doing a uni to uni on that. Okay.
And then on the other end, I'm using a Willis knot,
which
I think most people use, where you're sliding your mono up in, it's
that's pretty common as far as that goes.
Another knot that I use is the Albright. I use the Albright knot to tie my wire to my 30-pound backer. Albright knot is also a great knot for if you need to repair a copper on the fly. It's a good knot. It's not the easiest knot to tie if you don't tie it all the time. But basically, an Albright knot, if you tie it and you pull on it and it doesn't break, it's good.
See, I like the hay twist. When I got to repair a copper, I'm hay twisting it. Now, what about tying your wire diver, putting your swivel on your wire diver? What are you tying?
So there's a wire knot that's like a figure 8. A lot of people use it. I don't. Everyone on my boat uses it except for me. So
I don't.
You'll see you'll see different knots on our divers because I tie. So I just I take the swivel, I make a loop, I take the swivel, and I tie overhand knot. That's it.
Okay. I actually use a cinch knot.
I
actually just do the cinch knot, draw it down, and then do a half hitch over the top of it. I use a bead to help protect my knot.
Yep.
I've never had a failure, knock on wood.
I've never had a failure with my crazy knot that I use. So,
hey, whatever works, whatever works for you is the best thing. So,
and everybody, the other guys that fish with me, they just shake their head at my knot, but that's the knot I use. I don't know.
Hey, my grandfather, when he was teaching me how to fish, he says, when in doubt and you don't know how to can't tie those fancy knots, just do a bunch of square knots. So, he caught big pike and everything. So, I think we've covered a lot. I think we've gone through a tremendous amount of stuff, but we'd like to kind of open it up for questions and see what you guys have to.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you have any questions, let's get to that part and
go from there.
All right.